Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. If you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, we would love you to. And you can do so at patreon.com/the History Network. Thanks to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 38, Episode 6. Burning Seas and Silent Shores. The Shingle Street Invasion That Never Was. This episode was written by Richard Clements. Richard has held a keen interest in the Second World War for most of his life. He enjoys uncovering the lesser-known and unusual stories of the conflict and bringing them to life for new audiences. Living in East Anglia, not far from Shingle Street, he first heard the tale of the supposed invasion as a child, and it has stayed with him ever since. Picture the Suffolk coast on a stormy night in 1940. Waves crash against a bleak shingle bank. The wind howls through the marshes, and blackout shades cover every window in the tiny hamlet of Shingle Street. It was a place where the war felt uncomfortably close. Just across the North Sea laid occupied Europe. German bombers roared overhead almost nightly, and rumours of an imminent invasion travelled faster than the tide. It was here, in this lonely corner of England, that one of the strangest legends of the Second World War was born. The story claimed that German troops attempted a landing at Shingle Street. They were met not only by gunfire, but by a secret British weapon, a wall of flame that turned the sea itself into fire. By dawn, so the tale went, hundreds of charred bodies lay scattered across the beach. Yet official records insisted no such thing had ever happened. Let's take you into the fog of war, where rumour, secrecy, and fear gave rise to the enduring mystery of the invasion that never was. To understand why such a story could take hold, we must return to the summer of 1940. France had fallen, the Wehrmacht stood on the Channel coast. Hitler's Operation Sea Lion, his plan to invade Britain, was taking shape. East Anglia and its open beaches and direct line to the continent was seen as especially vulnerable. Suffolk, Essex, and Kent bristled with barbed wire, pillboxes, and troops on constant alert. Civilians were evacuated from some coastal villages, and rumours of German raiding parties were constant. As the historian Basil Collier later observed in his official study, The Defence of the United Kingdom, the fear of invasion was not only real but overwhelming. Shingle Street, a hamlet of cottages facing the sea, was no exception. Its isolation made it easy to imagine as the stage for a sudden German strike. In such a climate, a single spark of rumour could ignite into a roaring tale of fire and blood. So how did the story begin? According to later retellings, sometime in late summer or early autumn of 1940, villagers reported unusual activity. Soldiers cordoned off the area, strange lights and flames were seen offshore. And then came the rumours. German troops had landed, only to be incinerated by secret flame weapons. The bodies, it was said, washed ashore in the hundreds. Villagers claimed they were told to keep silent. Others remembered lorries removing corpses under cover of night. One of the earliest versions of the tale appeared not during the war itself, but years later in correspondence and local memory. The Sunday Express published a feature in 1946 hinting at a mystery battle on the Suffolk coast. By the 1950s, accounts were circulating more freely. Some claimed as many as 4,000 Germans had perished. Others suggested smaller commando parties. Whatever the number, the motive of bodies burnt beyond recognition persisted. The writer James Hayward, in his book Shingle Street, The Mystery of a Supposed German Invasion, notes that these details bore the hallmarks of rumour, shifting numbers, dramatic imagery, but no verifiable evidence. If there had been a German raid, what might they have hoped to achieve? Local speculation has long pointed to the radar installations at Bawdsey, a short distance from Shingle Street. Bawdsey Manor, only a few miles up the coast, was the birthplace of British radar research before the war. By 1940, it remained a critical link in the early warning system that allowed fighter command to anticipate Luftwaffe raids. German intelligence knew radar existed, though they did not fully appreciate its sophistication. A successful raid on the Suffolk coast might have disrupted Britain's fragile air defence network at a crucial moment. The historian David Pritchard, writing in the 1960s, argued that if German commandos had come ashore in East Anglia, this lends a sliver of plausibility to the Shingle Street story, though no evidence shows any such raid was launched. Still, when villagers heard the tale of bodies on the beach, linking it to a supposed attempt against radar sites seemed natural. In wartime, dots are quickly connected, whether or not the lines are real. At the heart of the legend was the idea of a secret weapon. During 1940, the Petroleum Warfare Department had indeed been experimenting with flame fugace devices, barrels of petrol detonated to spray fire across roads or beaches. In Suffolk, trials were carried out along stretches of coast, including near Shingle Street. The ministry also tested flame barrages at sea, attempting to ignite fuel sticks on the water to deter landing craft. Declassified files later confirmed that Shingle Street had been one such test site. The historian David Stafford, writing in Britain and European Resistance 1940–45, explains that secrecy around these experiments was absolute. Only a handful of officers knew the full extent of the trials. To local eyes, however, strange flames on the sea would have been deeply unsettling. Strange flames on the sea would have been deeply unsettling. In a community already primed to expect invasion, it was only a small step to imagine that those fires had consumed an enemy force. The beach at Shingle Street was sealed off during much of the war. Locals were restricted from wandering, and troops were stationed nearby. This added weight to the rumours. If nothing had happened, why were ordinary people barred from the coast? In a letter published in the 1950s, a former resident recalled that the whole place was crawling with soldiers, and that strange cargoes were taken away in the night. Oral testimony, even decades later, reinforced the legend. Some swore blind they had seen scorched uniforms or smelled burning flesh. Others insisted they had been told directly to keep quiet. It is worth noting that in wartime Britain such secrecy was not unusual. Beaches across East Anglia were closed, both for defence and for weapons testing. Yet in Shingle Street the combination of isolation, secrecy, and visible flame experiments provided perfect soil for rumour to grow. Britain's coastal defences in 1940 were a patchwork of old ideas and desperate innovation. Alongside the pillboxes and barbed wire, military scientists scrambled to devise weapons that could halt an invasion. The Petroleum Warfare Department known as the PWD, was at the centre of this effort. Its engineers experimented with turning Britain's own natural resources into weapons of fire. Petrol stored in barrels, pipes, or trenches could be pumped, sprayed, or detonated. The result was a searing wall of flame designed to terrify as much as destroy. The most famous of these was the flame fugace, simple but effective. It consisted of a 50-gallon drum of petrol, buried and camouflaged with an explosive charge beneath. When triggered, it sent a sheet of flame across a road or beach, capable of engulfing tanks or troops. Thousands of these were emplaced across the country. In some areas, like Kent and Suffolk, entire lines of flame fugaces were prepared along likely invasion routes. Then there were the sea-based experiments. One scheme involved pumping petrol into the water and igniting it, creating what witnesses described as a fiery tide. Another tested flame projectors, long pipes laid along the shoreline connected to fuel tanks and nozzles, ready to unleash a sudden inferno. These were prototypes, crude and dangerous, but in the dark months of 1940, no idea was too wild to try. It was precisely these kinds of experiments that were carried out near Shingle Street. Later, writers have suggested that villagers who glimpsed these tests, sheets of fire rolling across the sea, columns of smoke billowing skyward, mistook them for evidence of battle. In truth, the flames were Britain's own, summoned in secret against an enemy that never came. Yet secrecy breeds suspicion. The government's refusal to comment on coastal experiments left a vacuum that rumour readily filled. If officials had openly acknowledged flame tests at Shingle Street, the mystery might have been contained. Instead, strict censorship meant silence. Even local papers, such as the East Anglian Daily Times, published only the vaguest hints about unusual activity on the coast. For ordinary people, silence looked very much like a cover-up. And into that silence came the myth of the battle. Tales of charred bodies on the tide line carried a grim plausibility. After all, Britain was at war. The population expected raids, saboteurs, even poison gas. A story that the Germans had tried and failed to land was strangely comforting. As historian Angus Calder wrote in the People's War, stories like this gave people a sense that Britain was not only resisting, but striking back, armed with weapons too fearsome to reveal. Propaganda did not invent the Shingle Street story, but it certainly helped it to survive. Each time officials denied it, belief deepened. People assumed the government was hiding something, and the more fantastic the tale became, the more it fueled a kind of underground folklore, a story of victory hidden from public view. Decades later, when the story was retold in local histories and post-war memoirs, alleged eyewitnesses emerged. One villager recalled being told by soldiers to stay indoors and ask no questions. Another insisted she had seen trucks loaded with what looked like body bags. A wartime evacuee returning in the 1950s claimed neighbours spoke in hushed tones about the night the sea burned. These accounts, gathered long after the fact, cannot be verified, yet they reveal how powerfully the story had taken root in memory. Some accounts went further, describing not just bodies but scorched equipment, German weapons, singed uniforms, even melted helmets. Such details lent colour but not certainty. Oral historians warn that memory is often shaped by retelling, and in communities like Shingle Street, where secrecy and rumour blended, the line between recollection and folklore blurs very easily. Still, for those who lived there, the story was real, and when later publications repeated it, villagers saw confirmation of what they had always suspected, that a battle had taken place and the government had buried the evidence. Why did the idea of a raid on Shingle Street sound so believable? The answer lies in strategy. German doctrine in 1940 included the use of commando-style units for reconnaissance and sabotage. Small landings were conducted elsewhere in Europe. In Norway, for instance, German troops seized airfields and ports with sudden strikes. It was, therefore, entirely reasonable to imagine that East Anglia might be probed in the same way. Moreover, the Suffolk coast sat close to a series of valuable targets. Bawdsey Manor, just up the coast, was a hub of radar research and remained operational even after some of its scientists had been moved inland. Felixstowe, further south, held a naval base and airfield, and the entire stretch was defended by networks of minefields, artillery, and observation posts. If the Germans could disrupt radar or seize a beachhead, even briefly, they might undermine British confidence and gather valuable intelligence. Seen in that light, the Shingle Street tale fitted the fears of the time. It painted a picture of German aggression met with fierce resistance. The specific target, the radar station, gave the story a strategic logic. The fact that no German records corroborate such a raid has not prevented the theory from lingering. In war, plausibility sometimes matters more than proof. From the late 1940s onwards, the story began to appear in print. The Sunday Express hinted at a mystery battle. Later, Frank Faller's The Silent War in 1974 repeated the legend as if it were established fact. By the 1980s, local history groups in Suffolk were publishing pamphlets that included versions of the tale, often supported by anecdotal testimony. Some editions of the East Anglian Magazine carried letters from readers recalling the night the sea was on fire. Perhaps the most influential modern treatment came from James Hayward, whose Shingle Street, The Mystery of a Supposed German Invasion, 1993, sifted fact from rumour with forensic care. Hayward showed how the tale had grown in the telling, while pointing to the kernel of truth, the flame barrage experiments that probably gave birth to it. His conclusion was that no battle took place, but that the legend itself reveals much about wartime psychology. By the late 20th century, the Shingle Street story had become enough of a fixture in British wartime folklore that it reached Parliament itself. In 1990, nearly 50 years after the supposed events, an MP raised the matter in the House of Commons, asking whether the government would release all files relating to a German landing on the Suffolk coast. The request reflected how deeply the tale had entered public consciousness. Surely, if it had been nothing but rumour, there would be no harm in opening the archives. The response was unambiguous. The Ministry of Defence stated that there was no evidence of any German landing in Shingle Street and that all relative files had been reviewed. What the papers did not contain, however, were details of flame barrage experiments conducted in the area. Those tests had been classified for decades, and their secrecy likely fueled the original speculation. But the inquiry conducted that there had been no battle, no mass casualties, and no invasion attempt. Officially, the matter was settled. Yet, for many, the denial only confirmed their suspicions. Why had it taken so long for the government to comment? Why were the flame experiments hidden in the first place? And if officials admitted to testing such dangerous weapons on the coast, could they not also be hiding something darker? The 1990 exchange, rather than closing the case, gave new oxygen to the legend. By the 1990s, Britain was no longer fighting for survival, but the Cold War had bred its own culture of secrecy. Stories of cover-ups from UFO sightings to nuclear accidents thrived in an atmosphere where official denials were met with skepticism. The Shingle Street legend slotted easily into this mood. Books and magazines with a conspiratorial slant recycled the tale as proof of wartime deception. Some even suggested that the true scale of the German raid was deliberately concealed to protect morale, or that Winston Churchill himself had ordered the silence. Others took the theory further still, proposing that the British flame weapons tested at Shingle Street were precursors to Cold War napalm and incendiary devices. In this telling, the Germans were not only defeated, but became unwitting test subjects for experimental weapons. Historians such as James Hayward and Nigel West have been quick to dismiss such claims, pointing out the total lack of evidence in German war diaries or casualty records. Yet the persistence of these ideas shows how folklore adapts to new eras. In the 1940s, Shingle Street was a tale of secret victory. By the 1990s, it was recast as a tale of government conspiracy. What, then, are we to make of the story today? The balance of documentary evidence suggests it never happened. There was no German landing, no battle, no charred bodies on the tide line. The official records of both Britain and Germany agree on that point, and yet the legend endures. Why? Part of the answer lies in human memory. Villagers who saw flames on the sea or trucks moving under guard in 1940 remembered those sights vividly. When rumours of invasion circulated, the memories acquired new meaning. Over time, recollection and imagination intertwined until the distinction blurred. Oral historians call this collective memory, the process by which communities construct a shared narrative, regardless of strict factual truth. Another part lies in the psychology of wartime. In moments of fear, people create stories that give them strength. The Shingle Street legend offered reassurance that the enemy had tried and failed, that Britain had weapons too fearsome to reveal, and that Suffolk itself had played its part in defeating Hitler's plans. The tale became a kind of folk victory, celebrated not in parades, but in whispers and knowing nods. Finally, there is the allure of secrecy. The very fact that the files were locked away for decades gave the legend weight. As historian Nicholas Rankin observed in Churchill's Wizards, secrecy is fertile ground for myth-making. When the truth is hidden, imagination rushes to fill the void, and at Shingle Street that imagination conjured an entire battle out of fire and silence. Walk along Shingle Street today, and the scene is deceptively tranquil. The cottages line the shore, their walls weathered by sea winds. The shingle stretches for miles, shifting with each tide. The North Sea rolls in, restless and cold. It is hard to imagine flames on the water or soldiers lying in wait, yet the atmosphere carries a strange weight, as though the place remembers the rumours woven into its identity. Local guides sometimes mention the story to curious visitors. The beach has become a site not of battle but of legend. It stands alongside other wartime mysteries, the phantom army of D-Day, the ghost signals of radar, the secrecy of Bletchley Park, as a reminder that the Second World War was fought not only on land, sea and air, but also in the realm of imagination. So, did German troops really land on the Suffolk coast in 1940, only to be consumed by British fire? Almost certainly not. The bodies, the flames, the invasion, they belong to legend. Yet the legend itself is revealing. It tells us how fear and secrecy shaped wartime Britain, how ordinary people found meaning in stories of hidden victories, and how memory can transform tests of weapons into tales of battle. The Shingle Street story is not a chapter of military history in the strict sense. It is a chapter of wartime folklore, a myth that speaks to the anxieties of the age and to the enduring human need for stories that make sense of danger. Perhaps that is why, more than 80 years on, the legend still lingers. The sea washes the shingle smooth, the cottages stand in silence, but the whispers remain that one night in 1940 the Germans came and Britain turned them back into the waves. Well, thank you, Richard, for writing that episode for us.
And if you'd like to write a script for us, or you have an idea for a subject that you'd like to have covered, just drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org. And do consider becoming a patron. You can do so at patreon.com/thehistorynetwork. Once again, thank you to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast.
Written by Richard Clements, read by Nick Barker.